This is why NASA never returned to the moon after Apollo missions. The last crewed lunar mission, Apollo 17, took place between December 7th and December 19th, 1972. During the 12-day journey, several world records were broken, including the longest spacewalk, the longest lunar landing, and the largest lunar samples ever returned to Earth. So, what prompted NASA to cancel the following 3 Apollo-related missions? Why was Artemis put on hold for another 50 years? What caused NASA's problems with the lunar missions? Today, Space Union will explain the mystery behind the halted Apollo missions to the moon. Make sure you watch this video until the very end. It wasn't an understatement when Neil Armstrong stated that by taking the first step on the moon, he was making a giant leap for humanity. During the Apollo program, there were 6 crewed trips to the moon, with the 7th, Apollo 13, notably making an emergency return to Earth without landing. The landing of 12 humans on the moon remains one of NASA's most significant accomplishments, if not the biggest. During those trips, 12 astronauts conducted a variety of increasingly complex research on the moon, yielding new scientific insights into the evolution of our planetary neighbor. Each lunar exploration mission uncovered new regions and left behind nuclear-powered scientific instruments that continued to relay data to Earth for several years after the last astronaut returned from the moon. Astronauts returned to Earth after collecting rocks, photographing them, doing experiments, and planting flags. However, during their brief mission, the Apollo missions did not establish a permanent human presence on the moon. There are various reasons to send people back to Earth's enormous dusty satellite and dwell there for more than 45 years. More than 45 years after the last crewed lunar landing, Apollo 17, in December 1972. However, in December 1972, Apollo 17 signaled the end of the Apollo program. What prompted us to make this pause? The Apollo program was an expensive investment for the United States. While the program's cost varies according to historical sources, most analysts believe it cost at least $20 billion in 1973, which is almost $116 billion in 2019. NASA has used roughly 0.5% of annual federal spending in recent years, down from nearly 4% at its peak in the middle of the 1960s. NASA's funding was reduced by Congress for a couple of reasons. The space race, a competition between the Soviet Union and the United States to establish military and technological dominance over other countries, was the primary incentive for the moon mission. However, the competitive spirit cooled to détente later in the 1960s, and the strategic importance of funding NASA waned. The space race ended for many people when the Soviet Union was defeated on the moon. The cost of the Vietnam War, severe urban challenges, and a growing awareness of environmental crises all contributed to a significant loss in public support for costly human space exploration programs, which had never been particularly strong. That angered advocates of space exploration, who believed that Apollo would usher in a new era of space settlement, with humanity establishing bases on the moon, space stations in Earth orbit, and landing on Mars. The general shift in public and political sentiment toward decreased support, however, resulted in a small post-Apollo human space exploration program. The Apollo-Soyuz test project and Skylab used abandoned Apollo rockets and spacecraft and served as icons of the new era. Skylab, the first American space station, was a test habitat built from the 3rd stage of a Saturn V rocket. It was just intended to be a temporary space of habitation. The mission lasted nearly 3 months and was completed in February 1974. Skylab was occupied 3 times by a crew of 3 astronauts between 1973 and 1974. The Apollo-Soyuz test project effectively and symbolically ended the space race of the 1960s. Following years of intense struggle, the United States and the Soviet Union conducted their first cooperative space mission to emphasize a reduction in global tensions. A space encounter between an American and a Soviet spacecraft in July 1975 signaled the 2 countries' improved relations. During their many days in orbit, the crews visited each other's spacecraft, ate meals together, and participated in different activities. NASA intended to use Apollo 20 to launch human flights to the moon, while the Apollo Applications Program intended to transfer moon mission technologies for use in future exploration missions. However, congressional cuts to NASA funding hastened the program's demise until Apollo 17 in 1972. Most of the Apollo Application Program projects were shelved, except the space station Skylab. Other public priorities were also emerging, but before we proceed, if you enjoy content like this, please like this video and subscribe to this channel to receive more in-depth updates. The most notable of these public priorities were the costly Vietnam War, which required a significant share of the federal budget. After the first human moon landing, Apollo 11, on July 20, 1969, public interest in space waned. Space historians Roger D. Launius and Howard E. McCurdy present an additional case for Apollo in their 1997 book Spaceflight and the Myth of the Presidential Leadership. Out of concern for Soviet military capabilities, U.S. President John F. Kennedy made space exploration and the moon landings one of the country's core policies. With détente, NASA and its programs transferred to supplemental policy and have remained there ever since. NASA's priorities changed in the next few decades in response to congressional pressures, and its increasingly limited funds for human spaceflight were devoted to projects other than moon exploration. Following Apollo, the next big project was the reusable space shuttle, whose 5 ships conducted 135 missions between 1981 and 2011. Furthermore, NASA worked on many space station ideas that led to its participation in the International Space Station, the first components of which were launched in 1998. The International Space Station was advertised as both a science laboratory and a platform for world politics, notably with Russia, a newly independent country emerging from the dissolution of the Soviet Union at the time. Additional moon initiatives have been presented by 3 presidents throughout the years. Most of these proposals have been canceled due to funding problems and declining congressional support. These were George W. Bush's Vision for Space Exploration, which planned for lunar missions by 2020, and George H.W. Bush's Space Exploration Initiative, which sought to land humans on the moon by the turn of the century. Both programs terminated shortly after each president's term ended. The Donald Trump administration planned 2 important moon endeavors: the Gateway Lunar Space Station and Project Artemis, which aims for crewed landings by 2024. Outside of the United States and the Soviet Union, no country had built adequate space programs in the 1960s to consider sending people to the moon. However, governments like China, India, Japan, Russia, and the European Space Agency have all made public assertions about prospective moon landings in recent years. NASA is looking for International Space Station partners for the Artemis and Gateway partnerships. Any country or group that decides to send astronauts to the moon must accept some risk and make financial investments. Human moon missions need more resources than robotic moon landings, since humans require water, air, food, and other necessities to survive. Nonetheless, many governments, including commercial firms from those countries, are working on robotic moon projects that could aid upcoming human missions. NASA's Artemis 1 mission, which is due to launch in a few weeks, will hopefully result in the agency's first lunar landing in 50 years. It's a critical step in an ambitious plan to launch new spacecraft into orbit, build a lunar space station, and return humans to the moon for the first time since the Apollo missions concluded, and Gene Cernan and Harrison Schmitt became the last people to walk on the dusty regolith. With the launch of Artemis 1, the Space Launch System, a 32-story rocket topped by the Orion spacecraft, will make its debut. When the spaceship releases smaller spacecraft for lunar and extraterrestrial exploration, it will be 62 miles away from the lunar surface. Even though this inaugural mission will be uncrewed, Orion can transport humans further than any spacecraft has ever traveled. Others with astronauts are expected to follow in the coming years. The historic Artemis 1 mission has some science objectives, but it primarily serves as a technical display and a symbol. We are returning for everyone who has looked up at the moon and dreamed of the day when humanity will set foot on the moon's surface again. That journey, our quest, begins with Artemis 1. NASA Administrator Bill Nelson stated at a virtual press conference in early August. And that brings us to the end of this video. Do you think NASA will be able to launch the Artemis 1 SLS after 50 years? Let us know in the comments section. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and click on the notification bell to get notified when we post a new video.